The mysterious signal. In the vast expanse of space, silence was often the norm. Yet, on a calm evening aboard the human outpost Haven 7, a strange sound broke through the usual hum of machinery. At first, the signal was faint, like a whisper lost in a storm. The communication officer, a young and curious woman named Sarah, frowned as her console began to blink with an unusual pattern. The signal wasn't human. It wasn't anything she had seen before. The rest of the crew gathered around, intrigued and concerned. This outpost, located at the edge of explored space, rarely encountered anything noteworthy. Life here was simple, focused on monitoring activity in the region and assisting passing ships. But this signal was different. It was a cry for help. Help! We are dying. The broken words came through after hours of decoding. The message wasn't in a known language, but humanity's advanced AI translation systems pieced together fragments. The voice sounded desperate, almost broken, as if whoever sent it was clinging to their last hope. Captain Reynolds, an experienced leader with decades of service, stood silently, watching the team work. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the signal's origin. The location wasn't marked on any of their maps. It was deep in uncharted territory, near a planet infamous among explorers, Craxus 4, known as a death world. Craxus 4 was a place where no one dared to venture. Its extreme weather, hostile terrain, and deadly wildlife made it a forbidden zone. Why would anyone be there? Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. And why are they calling us? The question hung in the air. It was true. Out of all the species in the galaxy, humans were known for their resilience and adaptability. They had survived on worlds where others had failed, earning them the nickname Deathworlders. But still, it was strange. The galaxy was vast, full of advanced civilizations. Why would someone choose humans? Reynolds finally spoke. Whatever it is, they're in trouble. If we ignore this, they might not survive. The room fell silent. The Galactic Council had strict rules about uncharted planets, especially ones as dangerous as Craxus 4. No rescue missions, no interference. It wasn't worth the risk. But humanity's history was filled with stories of defiance, of answering calls others ignored. Let's find out more before we make a decision, Reynolds said firmly. Keep analyzing the signal. I want to know who sent it, and why. Hours turned into days as the crew worked tirelessly. The signal grew weaker, as if the sender didn't have much time left. Meanwhile, reports about Craxus 4 poured in. The planet's atmosphere was filled with toxic gases, its storms could rip apart the strongest ships, and its surface was crawling with predators unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. This is suicide, muttered one of the engineers. Even if we make it there, how do we know we can help them? But Sarah refused to give up. Something about the message tugged at her heart. She couldn't explain it, but the desperation in the voice felt too real to ignore. Finally, they decoded a crucial part of the message. It wasn't just a random cry for help. It was directed at humans specifically. Humans. Only you can save us. The revelation sent shockwaves through the team. Why would aliens on a deadly planet know about humanity? What did they mean by only you? Reynolds made his decision. We're going, he announced, his voice steady but firm. This is what we do. We don't turn away. Some of the crew hesitated, fear evident in their eyes. But others nodded, inspired by their captain's determination. Humanity's legacy in space was built on bravery and risk-taking. This was no different. As preparations began, the crew couldn't shake off the unease. Every piece of data about Craxus 4 painted a picture of certain death. Yet there was something compelling about the call. It wasn't just about survival. It felt like a test, a moment that could define what it meant to be human. In the final hours before departure, Sarah stood by the observation window, staring out into the endless void. Whoever they are, she whispered to herself, we won't let them down. With that, the team boarded their ship, ready to face the unknown. The engines roared to life, and the stars blurred as they set a course for Craxus 4. The mysterious signal grew weaker with each passing moment, but their resolve only grew stronger. Whatever awaited them on that deadly world, the Deathworlders were ready to answer the call. The team assembles. The signal had faded, but its echo lingered in the minds of Haven 7's crew. Captain Reynolds knew that if they were going to answer this mysterious call, they needed the right people for the job. Surviving Craxus 4 wasn't something just anyone could do. It required a team of Deathworlders, the kind of humans the galaxy whispered about in awe and fear. Deathworlders were rare. Not every human fit the description. They were the ones who had stared into the face of death and smiled, the kind who thrived in places no sane being would step foot in. If the galaxy had a problem no one could solve, it was the Deathworlders who answered. Reynolds stood in Haven 7's dimly lit war room, staring at a large holoscreen flickering with the profiles of potential candidates. His first call was to Dax Briggs, a combat engineer stationed on the outer edges of human space. Dax was a legend in his own right, the sole survivor of a failed mining operation on a molten planet. When everyone else fled, Dax stayed behind, wrestling with malfunctioning machinery while volcanic eruptions raged around him. Dax's response was brief. "I'll pack my gear." Next was Dr. Elena Crow, a xenobiologist who had lived among hostile alien tribes in unexplored regions. She had once befriended a species that considered humans prey, surviving not through violence, but by outsmarting them at every turn. Her knowledge of alien physiology could mean the difference between life and death if Craxus 4's ecosystem turned hostile. When Reynolds contacted her, she simply asked one question: "How dangerous?" "Very." "Good. I'll be there by morning." Reynolds's third call went to Mason Thorne, a survivalist known for his time stranded on an ice world for 2 years. He wasn't a soldier or scientist, just a man who refused to die. His sheer stubbornness had made him famous, and his deep understanding of adapting to hostile environments was invaluable. Thorne chuckled when he heard about the mission. "Deathworlders don't turn down invitations to nightmares, Captain. Count me in." Finally, Reynolds reached out to an old friend, Commander Jack Rourke, a seasoned pilot who had flown through asteroid storms and gravitational anomalies that would tear lesser ships apart. Rourke had a reputation for getting his crew out alive, no matter the odds. "I hope you're not calling to chat, Reynolds," Rourke said with a smirk. "I've been itching for something interesting. Send the coordinates." By the next day, the team stood aboard the Valiant Dawn, a rugged exploration vessel reinforced for hostile environments. As they gathered in the briefing room, Reynolds scanned their faces. These were not ordinary people. Each bore scars, visible and invisible, from battles the galaxy had long forgotten. Dax leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "So, this planet. What's the catch?" Reynolds pulled up a holographic display of Craxus 4. Violent red storms swirled across the surface, and jagged mountain ranges rose like the teeth of some ancient beast. Lightning danced in the clouds, and the temperature readings fluctuated dangerously. "It's a death world," Reynolds explained. "Toxic atmosphere, predators everywhere, and the ground barely holds together. We're going in because someone out there thinks humans are their only hope." Dr. Crow narrowed her eyes at the screen. "Whoever sent the signal knows us well. Why humans, though? The Galactic Council ignores places like this." "Exactly why we're going," Reynolds replied. "We're not the Council. We don't abandon people." Mason Thorne chuckled. "I like this already. Feels like home." The briefing continued late into the night. The crew fine-tuned their equipment, reinforced exosuits for the toxic air, energy rifles for defense, and portable shelters designed to withstand extreme weather. Every detail mattered. On a planet like Craxus 4, the smallest mistake could be fatal. As the ship prepared for launch, Rourke sat in the pilot's seat, running diagnostics on the engines. "You know," he called over his shoulder, "there's a reason no one else has gone to this planet. It's not just dangerous, it's cursed." Reynolds smirked. Good thing we don't believe in curses. With a deep hum, the Valiant Dawn's engines roared to life. The crew strapped in as the ship lifted off from Haven 7, piercing through the void of space towards the deadly, unknown world. For a brief moment, Sarah watched from the observation deck, feeling a strange sense of pride. Deathworlders didn't run from danger. They answered the call. Descent into the unknown. The Valiant Dawn sliced through the darkness of space like a silent predator, its hull glowing faintly under the distant light of an unnamed star. For hours, the crew sat in tense silence as the ship approached Craxus 4. From the cockpit, Commander Jack Rourke watched the swirling red clouds that wrapped around the planet like a suffocating blanket. The closer they got, the clearer it became. This world was alive, and it didn't welcome visitors. Atmospheric interference is spiking, Rourke muttered, his hands dancing over the controls. Sensors are struggling to give me a stable reading. Feels like flying blind. Captain Reynolds stood behind him, arms crossed. His eyes never left the view ahead. Stay steady. We're not turning back. The ship trembled as it breached the planet's outer atmosphere, passing through violent magnetic storms that lashed at the Valiant Dawn like invisible claws. Sparks flickered across the control panels. Just turbulence, Rourke said, though his grip on the controls tightened. In the back, Dax Briggs sat strapped into his seat, grinning like a man about to jump into a fight he knew he couldn't lose. I love this part, he said, cracking his knuckles. Mason Thorne, sitting nearby, shook his head. You love almost dying. It's not about dying, Thorne. It's about surviving when no one else can. Before Thorne could respond, Dr. Elena Crow's voice cut through the comms. I'm getting partial readings from the surface. The air is laced with sulfur and unknown particulates. Long-term exposure will be lethal. Long-term. Dax laughed. I wasn't planning on staying for tea. The ship descended further, cutting through thick clouds that rolled like waves in a stormy ocean. Flashes of lightning illuminated the jagged landscape below. Twisted rock formations, deep canyons, and massive trees with black, spiny branches reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. Sarah, monitoring from the co-pilot's seat, gasped softly. It looks hostile. It is, Reynolds replied. Let's just hope whatever sent that signal isn't worse than the planet itself. As they neared the surface, the ship's proximity alarm blared suddenly. Something's moving down there, Sarah reported, tapping frantically at the display. I'm reading multiple large signatures beneath the tree line. Rourke glanced at Reynolds. Wildlife. Dr. Crow leaned forward, narrowing her eyes at the data. Too big. Predators, maybe. We'll need to be careful. Reynolds nodded. We expected this. Keep an eye on them, but land near the signal source. Rourke maneuvered the Valiant Dawn carefully, searching for a stable landing zone. The terrain offered few options. Jagged rocks jutted out from the ground, and mist coiled around the trees, concealing what lay beneath. There, Sarah pointed. A small clearing near the edge of a canyon glowed faintly on the screen. It's not perfect, but it's the best shot we've got. Brace yourselves, Rourke said as the ship descended. With a deep metallic groan, the Valiant Dawn touched down. The engines hissed, venting steam as the landing gear settled into the rocky soil. For a brief moment, everything was quiet, save for the distant rumble of thunder. The crew unstrapped themselves and gathered at the loading ramp. Dax checked his gear, securing a large plasma rifle to his back. If anything moves, I shoot it. Crow adjusted her oxygen mask, attaching a small monitor to her wrist. Let's avoid unnecessary violence. This planet's ecosystem could be fragile. Dax smirked. I'll be gentle. As the ramp lowered, hot, sulfuric air poured into the ship. The stench was overpowering, burning their nostrils even through the filters. The sky above was a sickly red, swirling with clouds that blotted out the sun. Stepping onto the ground, Reynolds felt the weight of the planet's hostility pressing down on them. Every tree, Every rock seemed to pulse with quiet menace. Crow knelt, examining the soil. The ground's unstable. Whatever caused this erosion wasn't natural. Dax scanned the horizon. So where's our welcoming party? Before anyone could answer, a faint flicker of light appeared through the trees. The source of the signal. It pulsed gently, like a beacon calling to them. There, Reynolds said, pointing. Let's move. The crew advanced slowly, weapons drawn but lowered. As they moved deeper into the forest, shadows shifted around them, and faint growls echoed in the distance. The ground beneath their boots crunched with strange, brittle vegetation. Sarah stayed close to Reynolds. I feel like we're being watched. You are, Mason Thorne muttered. And whatever's watching isn't small. Minutes passed like hours as they neared the signal's origin. Finally, they broke into a clearing and froze. A small alien village lay in ruins before them. Crude shelters had collapsed, and strange markings scared the ground. In the center stood a tall, thin figure, draped in tattered robes. Its pale eyes locked onto the humans, and a flicker of hope crossed its face. You came, the alien rasped in broken English. Before anyone could respond, the trees behind them trembled violently. Dax tightened his grip on his rifle. Something's coming. From the shadows, glowing eyes appeared, circling them like wolves around prey. Reynolds stepped forward, raising his hand in peace. We're here to help, he said calmly. But deep down, he knew the hardest part of the mission was just beginning. First contact. The clearing felt too quiet. The kind of silence that stretched before a storm. The pale-eyed alien standing before the crew trembled, though it wasn't clear if it was from fear or exhaustion. Its thin frame swayed slightly, as if a strong wind could knock it over. Dr. Elena Crow was the first to step forward, lowering her rifle. It's all right, she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. We're here to help. The alien's eyes flickered from Crow to Reynolds, then to the rest of the crew. It hesitated, as if unsure whether to believe them. Mason Thorne crouched slightly, scanning the tree line where the glowing eyes continued to circle. We don't have much time, Thorne muttered. Whatever's out there isn't leaving. Reynolds took a step closer to the alien, moving slowly, his hands open and empty. We picked up your signal. We know you're in trouble. Let us help. The alien's gaze softened, its lips parted, and a series of strange clicks and whistles escaped, too complex for the crew to understand. After a brief pause, the alien tried again, this time forcing itself to speak human words. Follow, it rasped. Without waiting, the alien turned and began limping toward the village ruins. The crew exchanged wary glances that followed closely, keeping their weapons ready but lowered. As they moved deeper into the village, more figures began to emerge from the shadows. Frail aliens with hollow eyes and gaunt faces. Some clung to each other for support, while others barely managed to stand. Crow's breath caught in her throat. They're starving, she whispered. Dax Briggs frowned. Looks like they've been through hell. Sarah stepped beside Reynolds. How did they survive this long? They didn't, Reynolds replied quietly. Not all of them. The village was littered with remnants of makeshift graves, barely covered by loose dirt. The survivors glanced nervously at the sky, as if expecting something to descend at any moment. At the center of the village stood a large, damaged structure made of scavenged metal and stone. The alien who had led them there motioned toward it. This, home. Reynolds nodded. How many of you are left? The alien lowered its head. 30, maybe less. Before Reynolds could respond, Dr. Crow knelt beside one of the younger aliens, scanning it with her handheld device. The results flashed across her screen. Malnutrition, dehydration, and traces of toxic exposure. They can't stay here, she said firmly. Another week, and they won't survive. Suddenly, a deep guttural growl echoed from the edge of the clearing. The crew immediately raised their weapons, forming a protective circle around the villagers. Thorne's eyes narrowed. They've been watching us since we landed. From the tree line, massive shapes began to emerge. Hulking creatures with thick, dark scales and glowing red eyes. They moved like predators, slow and deliberate. Clawed hands dragged across the dirt, leaving deep grooves behind. Dax exhaled sharply. Well, they're bigger than I thought. Hold your ground, Reynolds ordered. The largest of the creatures stopped a few meters away, sniffing the air. Its nostrils flared as it locked eyes with Reynolds. These things hunt them, don't they? Sarah whispered. The pale-eyed alien next to Crow nodded. They always watch, always wait. We hide, but not forever. Today's not their day, Dax growled, cocking his rifle. Before anyone could react, one of the smaller creatures lunged forward with shocking speed, heading straight for the nearest villager. Open fire, Reynolds shouted. The clearing erupted in gunfire. Plasma bolts struck the creature mid-leap, sending it crashing to the ground in a heap of smoldering scales. The larger beasts roared in fury, surging toward the crew in a coordinated attack. Dax and Thorn fired in sync, cutting down the first wave as the aliens scrambled for cover. Dr. Crow pulled two of the youngest villagers behind the ruined structure, shielding them with her body. They're testing us, Thorn grunted, reloading. The largest predator charged forward, unfazed by the gunfire peppering its hide. Dax's rifle overheated, forcing him to switch to his plasma blade. Fine, he muttered. Let's get up close and personal. With a yell, Dax met the creature head-on, slashing at its face. The blade cut deep, but the creature swung a clawed arm, throwing Dax several feet across the clearing. Reynolds gritted his teeth. Rourke prepped the ship for immediate evac. Over the comms, Rourke's voice crackled through. You've got 5 minutes, Captain. After that, I'm coming in guns blazing. Reynolds fired a shot into the creature's exposed neck, drawing its attention away from Dax. Thorn rushed to his side, providing covered fire as the beast staggered, finally collapsing in a pool of dark fluid. As the remaining creatures hesitated, Reynolds raised his weapon, stepping forward. Leave, he growled. The beast snarled but began to retreat, disappearing into the dense forest. The clearing fell silent once more, save for the heavy breathing of the crew. Dax groaned, sitting up slowly. Next time, I get the smaller one. Reynolds glanced at the survivors huddled behind the structure. Their eyes were filled with cautious hope. It's over, he said, lowering his weapon. But we need to move fast. This isn't the last time they'll come. The pale-eyed alien stepped forward, bowing deeply. Thank you, Deathworlders. You came when no one else would. Reynolds nodded, scanning the village one last time. We're not done yet. Fight for survival. The forest around the village grew unnervingly quiet after the predators retreated, but Captain Reynolds knew better than to relax. Silence on a world like Craxus 4 wasn't peace, it was the calm before another storm. Dax Briggs wiped a smear of black blood from his face and winced as he stood. I think my ribs hate me, he muttered, flexing his arm. Mason Thorn gave him a dry look. Be thankful you still have ribs. Nearby, Dr. Elena Crow was tending to the injured villagers. Her hands moved quickly, wrapping wounds and injecting nutrients into their frail bodies. She glanced over at Reynolds. They can't stay here much longer. Their condition is worse than I thought. Reynolds nodded grimly. We'll get them out. Before he could continue, Sarah's voice crackled through the comms. She was inside the Valiant Dawn, monitoring the area from above. Captain, she said, her voice tense, we've got movement. A lot of it. The creatures are regrouping. Reynolds turned to the pale-eyed alien standing near him. How many of those things are out there? The alien's gaze shifted nervously to the trees. Too many. They'd wait for night. Dax frowned. And what happens at night? The alien's eyes darkened. They hunt together, like a storm. Reynolds tightened his grip on his rifle. Then we leave before nightfall. Rourke's voice broke in over the comms. Easier said than done, Captain. That storm you were worried about, it's moving fast. I'm reading heavy wind currents closing in. I can't hold this position forever. Reynolds cursed under his breath. Prepare for low-altitude evac. We'll bring the villagers to you. The crew moved swiftly, gathering the survivors and forming a protective circle around them. The pale-eyed alien, who Reynolds assumed was their leader, guided them toward the canyon's edge, where the valiant Dawn would descend. But they didn't get far. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the trees began to shake violently. The low growl that echoed through the forest was deeper this time, more resonant. Dax's eyes narrowed. That's not the same creature as before. No, Dr. Crow agreed. That's bigger. From the shadows emerged a massive figure, nearly 3 times the size of the predators they had fought earlier. Its thick scales glistened under the dull red light of the sky, and jagged spines ran along its back. The smaller creatures gathered behind it, their glowing eyes fixed on the humans and the helpless villagers. Thorn exhaled. Fantastic. They brought their king. Everyone, hold the line. Reynolds barked. The creature roared, shaking the ground as it advanced slowly, each step deliberate and heavy. Dax let out a low chuckle. I hate to say it, but this one's kind of impressive. No admiration, Reynolds snapped. Just kill it. The battle erupted in chaos. Plasma fire lit up the clearing as Dax and Thorn unleashed everything they had on the approaching beast. The villagers scrambled behind the crew, huddling together beneath the broken structures for cover. The larger predator barreled forward, shrugging off most of the firepower. It lunged, swiping at Thorn with a clawed hand. Thorn barely rolled out of the way, his exosuit groaning under the strain. This isn't working, Dax shouted. We need bigger guns. Rourke's voice cut through the comms. I'm on it. Stand by. High above, the valiant Dawn's cannons whirred to life. A burst of concentrated plasma rained down from the sky, slamming into the creature's flank. It howled in rage but didn't fall. It's tough, Sarah called from the ship. But it's feeling it. Reynolds switched his rifle to overload, aiming carefully. Aim for the head. Blind it if you can. Dax fired at its eyes, scoring a direct hit on one. The creature recoiled, roaring in fury. Blood poured from the wound, and its attacks grew wild and frenzied. Thorn seized the opportunity, planting a proximity mine at the creature's feet. With a sharp click, the mine activated. Everyone, get back, Thorn yelled. The explosion tore through the clearing, blasting the creature backward. When the dust settled, it lay motionless, steam rising from its shattered form. The smaller predators hesitated, uncertain now that their leader was gone. One by one, they slunk back into the shadows, disappearing into the forest. A heavy silence followed. Dax exhaled and collapsed to one knee. I swear, every time we answer one distress call, we nearly die. Reynolds grinned slightly. Wouldn't have it any other way. The villagers slowly emerged, their faces full of awe and gratitude. The pale-eyed alien bowed deeply. You saved us, he said softly. The storm was coming, and we would not have seen another sunrise. Reynolds looked up at the darkening sky. The wind was starting to howl. You're not safe yet, he replied. Let's get everyone on the ship. We'll get you out of here before that storm hits. As the valiant Dawn descended, its loading ramp extended. One by one, the villagers boarded, glancing back at the forest as if expecting the shadows to follow them. Dax paused at the base of the ramp, looking over his shoulder at the village. You think they'll rebuild? Crow stepped beside him. If they're smart, they won't come back at all. Reynolds patted Dax on the shoulder. Come on, our job's not done yet. As the valiant Dawn lifted off, the crew watched the ground shrink beneath them. Craxus 4 faded into the distance, but its memory would stay with them. Deathworlders didn't just survive. They answered the call, no matter the cost. The race against time. As the valiant Dawn climbed into the blood-red sky of Craxus 4, the crew's relief was short-lived. The storm, once distant on the horizon, was now rushing toward them like a tidal wave. Jagged bolts of red lightning tore through the clouds, illuminating the sky with each strike. In the cockpit, Rourke's hands flew over the controls. "This isn't just weather," he muttered. "The planet's tearing itself apart." Captain Reynolds stood behind him, watching the swirling clouds on the screen. Below, the alien village was already beginning to vanish beneath the advancing storm. The ground cracked and trembled as if the planet itself was groaning in protest. "Alina," Reynolds called through the comms, "how are the villagers holding up?" In the cargo bay, Dr. Crow was tending to the pale-eyed alien leader. His breathing was shallow, and the other villagers sat huddled in silence, their eyes wide with fear. "They're exhausted," Crow replied, pressing a nutrient injector to the alien's neck. "But we've stabilized them for now." Suddenly, a sharp alarm blared through the ship. Sarah's voice echoed over the comms from the co-pilot's seat. "Captain, we have a problem. The storm is accelerating, and it's pulling the canyon apart. We won't make it out in time." Rourke grimaced. "I can punch through the storm, but not with the extra weight. The engines are straining already." Reynolds' expression hardened. "You're saying we have to leave people behind?" Rourke hesitated, but the answer hung in the air unspoken. From the back of the cockpit, Dax Briggs stepped forward, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "We're not leaving anyone. Not on my watch." Thorne crossed his arms. "Then someone needs to buy us time. I'll stay with the villagers. Get the first group out, and come back for us." Reynolds shook his head. "That's not happening. We all get out together." The ship rattled violently as the first shockwave from the storm slammed into it. Red lightning arced across the hull, causing the lights to flicker. Sarah's voice grew urgent. "Captain, we're losing altitude. If we stay in this gravity well any longer, we're going down." Reynolds' jaw clenched. He glanced back at the pale-eyed alien, whose gaze met his with quiet understanding. "Let me stay," the alien leader said, his voice trembling but resolute. "My people are weak. They need to survive more than I do." Crow's eyes flashed with anger. "No, we didn't come all this way just to leave you behind." The ground beneath the Valiant Dawn cracked, and a massive fissure tore through the canyon below. Chunks of rock the size of ships collapsed into the depths, sending plumes of ash and smoke into the air. Rourke's grip tightened on the controls. "Captain, I can make a short trip into low orbit, drop off the first load, and return. But it's risky. One wrong move, and we're all done for." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Do it. We don't leave anyone." Dax slapped Thorne on the back. "I guess we're pulling babysitting duty down here." Thorne smirked. "At least the company's interesting." As the Valiant Dawn shifted into hover mode, Reynolds, Dax, Thorne, and a group of villagers disembarked, stepping onto the trembling canyon floor. The air shimmered with heat, and sulfur burned in their nostrils. Reynolds keyed his comm. "Rourke, get them to safety and come back for us." "You better be standing when I return," Rourke replied, lifting the Valiant Dawn off the ground. The ship vanished into the clouds, leaving behind a deep, oppressive silence. Dax glanced at the villagers, most of whom were staring at the darkening horizon. "So, what's the plan if that storm reaches us first?" Thorne grinned, checking his rifle. "We make it regret showing up." Reynolds walked to the edge of the canyon, watching the storm race toward them. Red lightning forked across the sky, igniting patches of vegetation and sending burning debris into the air. The alien leader stepped beside him. "This planet was once beautiful," he said quietly. "Before the storms, before the beasts." Reynolds glanced at him. "What happened?" The alien's eyes darkened. "It's dying, Captain. The storms grow stronger every year. The planet wants us gone." Before Reynolds could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A deep rumble echoed through the canyon, and the sky grew darker. Thorne frowned. "That's not the storm. From the fissure below, something massive began to rise. A serpentine creature with thick, segmented armor and glowing red eyes that mirrored the storm overhead. Its head broke the surface, sending debris flying as it let out a guttural roar. Dax's eyes widened. "You have got to be kidding me." The alien leader's face paled. The storm woke it. "We call it the Titan." Reynolds activated his comm. "Rourke, we have a situation. How soon can you be back?" Rourke's reply was grim. 10 minutes. Reynolds stared up at the Titan as it uncoiled, towering above them. "We might not have 10 minutes. Dax's plasma rifle whirred to life. "Then let's make this thing wish it stayed asleep." Reynolds took position beside him, raising his weapon. "Hold the line. Buy time for Rourke. No one falls today." The Titan roared again, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. As the storm loomed overhead and the monstrous creature descended upon them, Reynolds and his crew stood firm. Deathworlders to the last breath. The rescue complete. The Titan's roar echoed through the canyon, drowning out even the storm's furious howling. The ground trembled beneath its weight as it advanced, each step cracking the brittle surface. The surviving villagers huddled behind Reynolds, their eyes wide with terror as the massive creature loomed over them. Dax Briggs stood his ground, plasma rifle humming in his hands. "I'm starting to think this planet really doesn't like us." Mason Thorne wiped sweat from his brow, smirking as he tightened his grip on his grenade launcher. "Would you like to file a complaint?" Reynolds kept his gaze locked on the Titan's glowing red eyes. "We don't have to kill it. Just slow it down until Rourke hits back." The alien leader, pale and trembling, clutched Reynolds' arm. "You can't fight it. The Titan is the storm. Wherever it walks, destruction follows." Reynolds glanced at him, but didn't lower his rifle. "Then it's time to break the rules." Without another word, Reynolds signaled for Thorne to move left and Dax to cover the right flank. The three of them spread out, forming a triangle between the Titan and the villagers. The beast paused, tilting its head slightly as if it sensed the shift in tactics. It let out a low guttural growl, steam venting from cracks in its armor. The red lightning in the sky flickered in rhythm with the creature's breath, a living extension of the storm itself. Dax grinned. "All right, big guy. Let's dance." He opened fire, plasma bolts striking the Titan's armored hide with bursts of sizzling energy. The Titan barely flinched but turned its head, narrowing its glowing eyes at Dax. "That's right," Dax muttered. "Look at me, not them." The Titan lunged forward, its claws tearing through the ground as it closed the distance in seconds. Dax barely rolled out of the way as the beast's tail lashed behind it, snapping trees like twigs. Thorne fired his grenade launcher at the Titan's flank. The explosion sent shards of armor flying, leaving black scorch marks across its body. The creature roared, swinging toward Thorne with terrifying speed. Reynolds sprinted forward, activating his exosuit's thrusters to leap onto the Titan's back. He drove an energy blade into the base of its neck, anchoring himself to its spiked armor. Sparks flew as the blade sank in, and the Titan thrashed violently, trying to shake him off. "Captain," Thorne shouted, "I hope you know what you're doing." "Buying time," Reynolds grunted, tightening his grip as the Titan bucked beneath him. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the three humans battled a creature that had terrorized them for years. One of the younger aliens whispered, "They fight for us." The pale-eyed leader nodded solemnly. "They are Deathworlders. This is what they do." Above, the storm intensified, swirling faster as if responding to the Titan's rage. The wind howled, and bolts of red lightning struck dangerously close to the canyon floor. Sarah's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, Rourke's inbound. ETA 2 minutes. Just hold on." Reynolds clung to the Titan as it reared up, slamming its body into the canyon walls in an attempt to dislodge him. Dax and Thorne continued their assault from below, but their weapons were beginning to overheat. Any time now, Rourke, Dax muttered. Finally, the valiant dawn broke through the clouds, its engines blazing as it hovered above the battlefield. The ship's side cannons rotated, locking onto the Titan. Rourke's voice boomed through the comms. "Step back. I've got this." Reynolds yanked his blade free and leaped off the Titan's back, just as the valiant dawn opened fire. A concentrated beam of energy lanced down, striking the Titan square in the chest. The creature howled in agony, staggering backward as its armor cracked and molten fluid poured from the wound. The Titan stumbled to the edge of the canyon, teetering for a moment before letting out one final mournful roar. Then, with a thunderous crash, it toppled into the abyss below, vanishing into the darkness. The storm above began to ease, the clouds dispersing as if the Titan's fall had calmed the planet's fury. Reynolds exhaled, watching as the valiant dawn lowered its loading ramp. Dax clapped him on the back. "Nice ride, Captain. Think we could take one of those things home as a pet?" "No," Reynolds replied flatly. The villagers hurried aboard, their faces filled with relief and exhaustion. The pale-eyed alien leader paused at the ramp, turning to Reynolds. "You saved us," he said softly. "Why?" Reynolds met his gaze. "Because no one else would." The alien bowed deeply. "You are different from the others. You answer when the galaxy turns away." As the last of the villagers boarded, the valiant dawn lifted off, carrying them away from the broken world below. In the cockpit, Sarah smiled. "Well, that was easy." Dax laughed. "Sure, let's call it that." Reynolds watched Craxus 4 shrink into the distance. The village was gone, swallowed by the canyon, but the survivors would live to see another sunrise. And somewhere, out in the vastness of space, another signal would call for help. When it did, the Deathworlders would be ready to answer.